Good afternoon. Today we're going to complete day 8, and actually the material we're going to cover right now, the audit risk model, is out of chapter 9, pages 278 to 2. The audit risk model is one of the 4 things I think is most important in this class. The objective definitions, assertions, the audit reporting model, and now the audit risk model. Those are the 4 biggies in my mind. The audit risk model, as I learned it, was audit risk equal inherent risk times control risk times detection risk. It's a planning model. It's help you think through how you're going to plan your audit. Inherent risk and control risk are often combined and called the risk of material misstatement, ROM. So audit risk equal inherent risk times control risk times detection risk. Now this book uses the term plan detection risk. I like it a lot. It is a planning model, so I think that's very appropriate. They rearrange the formula and say plan detection risk equal audit risk divided by inherent risk times control risk, or plan detection risk equal acceptable audit risk over ROM. Now, if we pretend, nice pretend, well, there we go. If we pretend that auditing standards require audit risk to be less than 0.05, we're going to pretend auditing standards don't require that, but let's pretend that auditing standards require that. Then the numerator becomes a constant. Then we have plan detection risk equals some constant, 0.05, over inherent risk times control risk. In other words, plan detection risk becomes a function of control risk. In our world, I'm just going to always set inherent risk equal to 1, so it kind of falls out. So effectively, plan detection risk becomes a function of control risk. We have to figure out what control risk is before we can plan the rest of the audit. Audit risk, what is it? The risk that the auditor expresses an inappropriate opinion when the financial statements are materially misstated. Should you know that? Yes. Word for word, real close. Acceptable audit risk, on the other hand, is a measure of how willing the auditor is to accept that the financial statements may be materially misstated after the audit's completed and they've issued an unmodified opinion. Now, I'm going to focus more on the definition of audit risk, but I think it's worthwhile to talk about acceptable audit risk. The book includes it. Each partner has different risk aversion. So how willing is the audit partner? How willing are they to be wrong? They have to accept some risk. So acceptable audit risk is a measure of how willing the auditor is to accept the financial statements may contain a material misstatement after the audit's completed and they've issued an unmodified opinion. I think of the little office in Phoenix I worked in, Arthur Young. It was a predecessor to Ernst & Young. We had 2 audit partners. Ken was very conservative. I mean, when Ken said the financial statements were fairly presented, they were fairly presented. Jack, on the hand, was a bit of a riverboat gambler. There's a long story behind that, but Jack was willing to take very, very significant risks, where Ken was very, very conservative. So this acceptable audit risk varies by partner, from partner to partner. Plan detection risk. Now, I like the plan detection risk because we're talking now at the beginning of the audit. We're planning the audit. The audit risk model, in fact, is a planning model, so this is appropriate. The risk that the procedures performed by the auditor to reduce audit risk to an acceptably low level will not detect a misstatement that exists and could be material, either individually or aggregated with others. So for this, I'm not really a stickler. I want you to know what detection risk is, but the procedures performed by the auditor don't reduce audit risk to an acceptably low level. The procedures performed by the auditor may not detect a material misstatement. So I want to know that you know that the detection risk is the auditor. The auditor can reduce detection risk with the procedures they perform. Control risk, on the other hand, I expect you to know the definition virtually word for word. The risk that a misstatement could occur in an assertion about a class of transaction, account balance, or disclosure that could be material will not prevented or detected and corrected by the internal control. So I think I've emphasized the important words there. The risk that a misstatement could occur, you can put the risk that a material misstatement could occur, don't care. Then this thing about assertion, class of transactions, account balance, or disclosure, that's a lot of words, but we know assertions apply to transactions, account balances, and disclosures. So we audit the assertions. There could be a material misstatement and assertion, and then we know that assertions relate to transactions, account balances, or disclosures. Will not be prevented or detected and corrected by the entity's internal control. Now you'll notice the or and are highly emphasized here, and the reason they are is the client's internal controls can prevent a mistake. If they are designed to prevent mistakes, if there's no mistake, they will not need to correct them. So this is an or. However, if the controls detect a misstatement, then it will have to be corrected. So it's detected and corrected. So the or and the and tell me a lot about how well you understand this concept. Pretty much word for word on this definition, or all the purple words and red words. Detection risk and control risk have an inverse relationship. If control risk is low, detection risk can be high. If the control risk is high, detection risk must be low. Okay. If control risk is low, we need evidence to prove that the controls are effective. If controls risk is high, that means controls are not effective, then plan detection risk must be reduced to a low level. If plan detection risk is high, we can limit our substantive test. If plan detection risk is high, that implies control risk is low, so we're going to rely on their controls. If plan detection risk is low, that implies their controls are not effective, and we're going to have to perform extensive substantive tests. This is a visual I made. I don't know whether it helps or not. If it does, fine. If not, fine. We got audit risk equal inherent risk times control risk times detection risk. It points out the yellow, the environmental. Nobody has any control over it. The blue is client has control over it. So control risk, the client controls. And we can't reduce control risk, but we assess it. We perform tests of controls to make sure our assessment of control risk is reasonably accurate. Now, when we combine inherent risk and control risk, we've got risk of material misstatement, ROM. Now you'll notice transactions, there's a purple area that kind of bridges from control risk and detection risk. And that's because we test controls, we almost always, not always, but almost always test transactions. We can also perform substantive test of transactions. If you completed the Vouch and Trace project, those were substantive tests of transactions to see if the sales account was correct. Okay. I should say the word fairly presented. So the purple area represents transactions, which typically we're doing test of controls, but we may do some substantive test of transactions. Usually, if we do substantive test of transactions, we will do them at the same time as the test of controls because we're looking at the same transactions often. Then we've got detection risk, which includes substantive test of transactions, substantive analytical procedures, and test of details of account balances. And these are substantive analytical procedures and test of details of account balances are testing balances rather than transactions. So where we're talking about purple, those would be the assertions that relate to transactions. Where we talk about this ochre color, we'd be talking about assertions that relate to account balances. All three are types of test: substantive test of detail, transactions, substantive analytical procedures, and test of details are all three procedures performed by the auditor. And the auditor can reduce detection risk by performing substantive tests. Okay. Auditors are unable to reduce inherent risk or control risk. I would argue nobody can reduce an inherent risk. It's inherently risky. Control risk, the client controls with their control procedures, their internal controls. But the auditor cannot reduce control risk. The client either has effective controls or not before we get there. We assess the control risk. We assess how effective their internal controls are. We can't reduce it, but the more test of controls we perform, the more comfortable we become with our assessment. So if we perform more test of controls, we will be more comfortable that our assessment of control risk is reasonably correct. Our old buddy, Audit Objective 13, identify and assess the risk of material misstatement. How? By understanding the entity, its environment, and its internal controls. We are always required to understand the internal controls, regardless of our audit approach. This is a thou shalt. So Objective AU 13 says that we must identify and assess the risk of material misstatement by obtaining an understanding of the internal controls. 500. Design and perform audit procedures to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Okay. We are always required to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, regardless of our audit approach. We obtain audit evidence by performing audit procedures. We may call them tests, we may call them procedures, but we obtain evidence by performing audit procedures or performing audit tests. Notice the wording here. If the assessed level of control risk is low, if their controls are effective, then plan detection risk can be high. If the assessed level of control risk is high, then plan detection risk must be low. I want you to think, why does it say can be in the first case and must be in the lower case? Okay, so if assessed risk of control, if the assessed level of control risk is low, that means their controls are effective. We are going to rely on their internal controls, the effectiveness of their internal controls. In that case, plan detection risk can be high because we're going to rely on their internal controls. If we want to do extensive substantive testing, plan detection risk can be low too. It's just going to cost more. If the assessed level of control risk is high, that implies their controls are not effective. If their controls are not effective, we can't rely on their internal controls, so we must perform extensive substantive tests in order to reduce detection risk to an acceptably low level. If we assess control risk as low, we will need to test the effectiveness of internal controls. We'll need to perform extensive tests of internal controls in order to obtain evidence that the controls are in fact effective. It's not enough that we believe the controls are effective. We need evidence showing that they are. If plan detection risk is high, that means we preliminarily assess control risk as low. If plan detection risk is low, that means we preliminarily assess control risk as high. It's almost that easy, folks. Now, we're going to throw in some wrinkles and some speed bumps, but this inverse relationship, make sure you get it through your head because there's going to be a lot of questions over the quarter that depend on your understanding of this. Whoa, he misspelled end. That is the end of day 8's lecture. Take off a point for spelling. Sorry.